SDSC and the National Security College is delighted to have with us this evening a distinguished American leader, Admiral Dennis Blair, a man who had an outstanding career for over 3 decades in the US Navy, who thereafter served as the Director of National Intelligence, and who continues to be a strong voice on strategic issues in the United States and beyond. He comes with a record of service to his country and to the wider international community that few can match. So to have him here this evening talking about directions in American strategy is a tremendous honour for us. We welcome him warmly and we look forward to his remarks. Admiral.
Well, thanks very much, Michael. It is a pleasure, personal pleasure, to be back in Australia. I was thinking back to my first visit as a young naval officer in the mid-1980s. I was commander of a ship which was finishing a 6-month deployment out in the Indian Ocean and Persian Gulf, and then we had 112 consecutive days at sea when we pulled into Perth. And my wife flew down to Perth to join me there, and we had, for what was us, our second, third, and fourth honeymoon all piled into about 3 days. So I consider Australia a sacred soil, worth defending like my own country, and I've always taken that attitude in the many years since that I've had the pleasure of working with Australians. Many colleagues. We share so much in common in terms of both our values and our interests and our abilities to both cooperate and be honest with one another. So it's a real both pleasure and honor to be back here. And thanks very much, Michael and Admiral Barry, for the invitation. Our interest this evening is strategy, and strategy is perhaps one of the most misused, overused terms in the lexicon of strat talk today. I think perhaps it's only been rivaled recently by discourse. I don't know if this is popular in seminars in Australian academia, but one talks about discourse. Not quite clear what one means, but one uses the term very often. A little earlier it was vision, I think, was in sort of the same category. Terms which could encompass huge amounts of fuzzy thinking and appear to be saying something profound. Strategy is in its own class, though. After I left the service, I was a member of a corporate board of a big company, and as often happens on board meetings, we had a high-priced management consultant come in to tell us how to improve our company, and he kept using the word strategy, and he was not using it very accurately, misusing it in terms of my understanding of it, and so I finally raised my hand and asked him what he meant by strategy. Would he please define it? Because those of us who are raised in the armed forces know exactly what strategy is, and it turned out that my suspicions were confirmed. He had no idea what strategy really was. So I think when we're talking in this area, it's worth going back to basics and reminding ourselves what the basic definition of strategy is. And what it is relating the ends that you seek to the means that you have to achieve them, and building a connective tissue between those two so that you can get from here to there with some confidence of success, figuring out how you take the resources that you have, find a way to reach the objective that you decide you want to achieve. So when we think about American strategy, Australian strategy, alliance strategy for this Asia-Pacific region, we sort of have to begin with where we want this region to be 5, 10, 20 years in the future. And I think we could all pretty well agree pretty quickly that where we want this Asia-Pacific region to be is peaceful, prosperous, democratic part of the world as it becomes increasingly important on the global scale with the concentration of economic and other forms of power. So a peaceful, prosperous Asia-Pacific region is what we seek. That's the end. If that sounds a lot like the Asia-Pacific region that we in fact live in today, I think that's really no accident. I believe that if we were sitting around 2 generations, 4 decades ago, and trying to think what is the end that we seek for the Asia-Pacific region, we would probably have agreed on the same objective, the same state that we sought. And I believe that these last 2 generations, having achieved that goal, or a pretty good facsimile of it, means that we've had a successful strategy here, a strategy of the United States, a strategy of its allies like Australia and other partners in the region. And in fact, the peace, prosperity, and democratic character of this part of the world have in fact grown over the last 40 years and moving forward strongly. So that's the objective, that's the end that we seek. And the means, the resources, the capabilities that were put into that strategy are also fairly well known from the last 40 years ago. They include, from the American point of view, a strong set of mutual defense alliances with individual countries in the region, a strong forward deployed American military presence backed up with forces outside of the region, which periodically rotate through this region for interaction in the region, open American markets for the goods that are produced here and the open financial system that supports those transactions, and general advocacy of representative governments, rule of law, respect for human rights by the governments in the region. And those are really, I would argue, are the means, the capabilities that we have used to pursue the objective along with our partners and allies and friends. And over the years, individual American policies, reactions to crises, individual decisions have varied, but the fundamental objectives and the resources that we applied to them have been pretty consistent, and I would say that the result has been pretty successful. One result of this success, I think, has been that the United States has developed a record of regional trust from other countries in the region. The United States has pretty well established that while, yes, it benefits as a nation from a peaceful, prosperous, more democratic Asia-Pacific region, it's willing, indeed it's in favor of the benefits being more widely spread, not simply benefits that come to the United States, but benefits that are spread out through the region. So if an ally decides, for example, not to renew a U.S. basing agreement, as the Philippines did in the early 1990s, the United States says, okay, we'll move elsewhere, as we did. If an ally competes with us in an important domestic industry like automobile manufacture and seems to produce a more reliable car at a cheaper price, Americans tend to buy it and then raise their own game, try to build these better cars themselves, and get back into the market and compete for it. If an ally who produces a tasty product like beef happens to take a share of the international market away from American farmers, we work out a sort of an agreement in which nobody is completely disadvantaged, nobody completely wins, and we move on to the next issue. So I think this strategy that the United States has, which, yes, is in the American interest over the long term, but also is part of a system that seems to benefit many other countries, has earned for the United States a degree of trust in this strategy, which will engender cooperation and not suspicion from a lot of other countries. Minister-mentor Lee Kuan Yew is admired by many of us for both what he accomplished in Singapore and also for his trenchant insights into what's going on in the region. And he has no hesitation about instructing you in those insights whenever you happen to meet him, or he happens to visit you, or he writes something in the publications. And in his fascinating 2 volumes of memoirs, he has a chapter on the United States, and he says something like this: if you have to have a big dominant country in your region, the United States is probably better than most, which is high praise coming from Mr. Mentor. But I think it basically epitomizes this sort of realistic understanding of what American strategy has been in this region heretofore, and the fact that it has provided fairly widespread benefits to the region. So, last 40 years, 2 generations, worked pretty well. Region's getting better. Things are going pretty well. Why can't we just take this same tried and true strategy and the resources that support it and use it for the next 40 years, and life would still continue to be good? And the 2-syllable, 1-word answer to that question, of course, is China. In the past 40 years, in this region, there simply was not a powerful regional country that had military projection capability of a serious nature, that could open or close its markets to its own advantages, and that carried a sense of grievance, dissatisfaction with the status quo. It simply was not that a factor here for the past 40 years. And now there is. And the region must adjust to it. The United States must adjust to it. We must figure out how to attain our objectives with our resources in the face of this new circumstance. So how do we proceed? I believe that the fundamental strategy that we have followed over the past 2 generations is still right, but I believe we have to adopt more innovative tactics and make better decisions in the future. And I think we need to strengthen those basic capabilities, the means, the resources for our strategy in order to be as successful in the future as we have been in the past. And by success, I mean in the overall regional sense, not just in the sense of what's good for the United States. So let me go over those components, those parts of those capabilities which are important, have been important for our strategy in the past, and talk about how they will be important for the future. I talked about the foundational resource of our alliance and partnership relationships across the region. The U.S. bilateral relationships with the Republic of Korea, with Japan, with Australia, which are our strong mutual defense treaty partners, need to be tended, reinforced, and really strengthened by both sides in those relationships. Minor issues, such as specifics of basing arrangements, status of forces agreements, and so on, individual trade disputes and the like, have to be handled by negotiation, compromise, and relatively quick solutions to move on. They can't be allowed to linger as festering sores which tend to dominate the relationship to the exclusion of the more important common goals and objectives that we share. And this takes work by governments on both sides, by the practitioners in the trenches who are doing the actual day-to-day work, and by the guidance that they receive from their governments. And the same goes for our partners and treaty allies that are in a somewhat different category, but nonetheless are fundamentally countries that we have and intend to work with. And these include the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and the same attitude of not allowing the minor differences between us to dominate the relationship, but to come up with a mechanism, the attention that to solve these issues and strengthen the overall relationship for the important common goals we have has to be something that's the day-to-day business of diplomacy, military interactions, trade interactions, and financial arrangements. But I think in addition to these relationships, which were really built on the old hub-and-spoke relationships of the past with the U.S. at the center and individual bilateral relationships to other countries, this hub-and-spoke system needs to be changed into a network in which there are far more connections among these countries than simply their relationship with the United States. The relationship between Japan and Korea, for example, is extremely important to develop. They have far more in common than their histories allow them to believe, but yet we've seen instances of the power of that history in which a relatively simple logistic arrangement that was made between the two armed forces here a couple of weeks ago had to be repudiated and actually withdrawn, put on the shelf because of popular response based on lingering historical animosities. And we've got to get beyond that in terms of the mature relationships among the countries that have had often bilateral relationships with the United States, and in which many cases the United States has picked up a telephone here, turned them around so the speaker of one faced the receiver of the other and let them talk to one each other, but we were holding the two headsets, and that kind of needs to take place without the United States being there in that intermediary position. I think this is very true for Australia, which has a lot that it can do and should do in the security area with Japan, with Korea, with the Philippines, with Singapore, with other countries, and we should think of this as a positive contribution to all of our security, not trying to play I've got a secret with country X that I'm not going to share with country Y, who's a partner and who has the same overall objectives. Now, these security relationships, whether they be hub and spoke, bilateral, or whether they be more networked, which I think is the way of the future, should not exclude China, but rather they should seek to include China in the many security tasks which face all of us. And these are everything from simple things like search and rescue, disaster relief, which is more important in this part of the world, and we've seen many instances in which it's been used and could be made better. Maritime security, which is of interest to all. Peacekeeping. The objective remains for China to continue to enjoy the benefits of this security architecture, which exists in the Asia-Pacific region and has been developed over the years, but also for it to enable its neighbors to also enjoy the same sorts of benefits. So, I think security relationships, whether they be strengthening and deepening of traditional alliance relationships, or reaching out across the region for these common tasks that we all face together, needs to be an area of steady emphasis for the future, even more than it has been in the past. And the second component of our strategy in the past that I had mentioned is the strong forward deployed military presence that the United States has maintained in this region, based primarily in Northeast Asia, but operating throughout the region. China's military strength, which has been building at double-digit rates for the last 15 years, has raised the price of poker in the region. It takes more to be seriously in the game than it was before China made these advances. Now, I mentioned America's 40-year record of building up trust means that when the U.S. has a major exercise in part of the world, it's not a big statement. It's something that's probably been done before. It's something that the countries of the region understand. In most cases, they are participating in it themselves, and it's no big deal. China has not yet developed that track record, that understanding, that trust from the countries in the region. And when there's a major amphibious exercise by China in a part of the world that's intended to send a signal, it sends tremors in the region. It has consequences that will only cease to exist when China, as I say, has developed this record of cooperation and understanding with its neighbors in a military sense, which the United States has and many other countries here have achieved over time. So until that time exists, the United States, with its forward deployed forces, Australia, other countries in the region will have to increase, modernize, strengthen their own military forces in order to maintain the same sort of balance. However, although I started with these military and security elements of American strategy, they're not the main elements. They're not really the positive elements of a strategy that have produced the results I've talked about. Basically, they provide a stable underlying security foundation when done best in the background, not the focus of a lot of public attention, not the thing that makes the news, but the situation that makes everyone in the region realize that military aggression, using military force for unilateral advantage is pretty unattractive, will probably be unsuccessful, and is not worth really taking on as a serious policy option. So you have to tend to it. You have to do it well, but it's best if it doesn't become an open, visible, and public factor in the region, but rather is sort of the background scenery that everyone understands and that turns their minds to other things. And what are those other things? Those are what I think are still the engines for progress, both in the economic sense and in the social and governance sense in this part of the region. What will make this region more prosperous, more peaceful, more democratic, I believe, will be the combination of diplomatic, economic, and non-governmental activities which can take place at an even more accelerated rate here in the future than they have in the past. On the diplomatic front, though, in particular, I think the way forward has to be multilateral, compromise, negotiated approaches based on common international standards. And this approach applies to territorial issues, resource issues. These are fairly well-known points of dispute from the past. Also, things that will be increasingly important challenges in the future, like water rights, climate change, unlawful activity that goes across international borders, in which unlawful elements take advantage of borders in order to try to conduct illegal activities, and which can only be stopped to the benefit of all nations by cooperation by sovereign nations across those borders. And these activities have to be negotiated. Common approaches have to be agreed upon, and this sort of activity, I think, needs to be intensified from what it has been in the past. Although, as those of you who've been involved in the region and those of you who've studied it know, there's a lot of this that's been going on already. It needs to be intensified. It needs to be more regular. It needs to be made more accepted. And when countries choose not to participate in this kind of approach to solving common challenges that can have common benefits, they must overcome unified opposition by the entire rest of the region. And I can tell you that sort of unified front by an entire region is pretty powerful. Now, I am told that I was a high government official of a country which was not the world's single superpower. We were even a hyperpower, if you could believe the cover of Time magazine for certain places. Man, we had it all in the mid-1990s. I can tell you from the inside, it certainly didn't feel like it. Certainly didn't feel like we had repealed the laws of physics, that the United States could go out and do anything it wanted in the world, no matter what the other countries in the region felt. When we were faced by unified, coordinated, thoughtful, deliberate opposition from a wide variety of countries, whether or not they could measure up to us in military power or not, it gave us pause as a country. We rethought what it was we were doing, and we considered that maybe there was a better approach to whatever objective we were trying to achieve. And China is far from this sort of dominant position in the region, and may well never attain it. But I think China too is subject to the same sort of international pressure if it's based on commonly objective standards, if all agree to it and all expect it across the region because they believe it is in all of their benefits. I think a similar approach has to be taken on the economic, the commercial, the trade, the financial side, that the Asia-Pacific region needs to be rules-based, transparent, consistent across these important issues. And so things like exchange rate disputes, trade disputes, intellectual property rights, and the rest need to be decided by WTO rules, perhaps, or some similar set of internationally negotiated and accepted standards. And unilateral measures that violate these sorts of signed agreements should be isolated by the rest of the community, should be sanctioned, and should be the objective of unified opposition by those who sign up for the rules and feel that they will benefit all. And China, of course, is welcome to join in this diplomatic activity, this economic activity. It's welcome to argue for changes in a rule-based organization. Chinese, many times, and rightly so, argue that although they benefited from this system in the past, they did not have a part in making it. And if they want to figure out a way to make the renminbi a reserve currency to displace part of the dollar, then have at it. But it has to be done in a way that is done with cooperation of all, since these activities affect all, and it has to be something that benefits all, not just one country. I think the prospects for this sort of approach are positive, certainly on the diplomatic and economic and military security front. China has benefited from the past system, the current system, as much as any country in the Asia-Pacific region. But it knows that its economic development and its social development are far from complete. It has, and good for it, raised 250 million people out of poverty and got them into a position in which they can enjoy a much better life, the single greatest anti-poverty success that the world has ever known. But China will need resources, finances, international technology, international trade in order to get that next 500 million across that line out of poverty and into the kind of life that three-quarters of, or that the other quarter of Chinese have learned to take advantage of. And it can only do this as a part of the international system. And the international system, I think, the other countries in the region around the world can insist on support for this sort of a mutually beneficial system, which does not yield simply unilateral benefits, but also provides the opportunity for benefits much more widely spread. So my conviction, having watched this a while and thought about it a lot, is that the United States, its friends, allies, and partners, and like-minded countries in the region, certainly including Australia, we need to raise our strategic game in the Asia-Pacific region. But we don't need to invent an entirely new game. We don't need to completely throw out everything that we've learned in the past and come up with some brand new approach. So this means that on the one extreme, we absolutely should not cast China as it increases its power as a threat, an enemy that we will inevitably face one day, so we might as well start opposing them right now, because haven't we learned from history that sooner is better than later? That's the one extreme that I see no justification or advantage in setting as a strategy for the region. And on the other hand, I don't think it's justified, wise, or prudent to cast China as a country which will automatically become a benevolent power simply of its own internal developments, that it will inevitably develop a stake in the status quo. It will develop a commitment to common goods and a respecter of the standards that cause some sacrifice to be taken of its own interests, its own advantage, in order to support the overall system. I don't think we can base a strategy on that comfortable assumption either. I think rather that we have to be clear and confident in those objectives that we seek for the region. We should be firm in our use of the capabilities that we all have who seek that common future for this region. We must, as I say, raise our game, be innovative, persistent in the specific tactics that we adopt along the way, the decisions we make, the courses of action that we pursue as we meet new circumstances in order to achieve timeless goals. Because I believe that beyond strategy, on the distance hill, really lies responsibility of this region. The world power center is shifting to where you all live now and where the United States is heavily engaged, to the Asia-Pacific region. And we are the grandchildren of those who led this region 2 generations ago and did a pretty good job with their strategy, and I believe we live now, thanks to their wisdom and their hard work, in a region which was better than it was at their time across the parameters that we think are important. We have benefited from their vision, their accomplishment. And I really believe that it is our responsibility to deliver to our grandchildren an even better version of those same common goods which we all seek, and we need to be both clear-eyed, persistent, and responsible in pursuing a strategy to reach those goals.